Why Geostrat's Single Card History, a series where I'm talking about some of the cards that have impacted Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout the years, and some of the other ones that just didn't. Today's card is the trap card we all wished was better than it is, Witch's Strike. Witch's Strike was first released in Savage Strike in 2019, with one reprint in the 2020 Megatins to date. As of this video, it has spent no time on the ban list, and likely never will. A normal trap card, its effect reads: if your opponent negates the normal or special summon of a monster's, or the activation of a card or effect, destroy all cards your opponent controls and in their hand. Witch's Strike is a card with an insanely powerful effect that seems very easy to activate, but kinda isn't. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has only grown in regards to negates, with more and more things including the word. Dueling Book has 63 pages of cards that mention it, which is at least 1,200 cards. Granted, that includes the likes of Alien Mars, which isn't exactly what most of us are thinking about when talking about negates, but even if only one of every 4 of those cards is good, that still leaves us with 300 cards with meaningful negates, which should mean that there's 300 good cards for Witch's Strike to be used against, right? Unfortunately, not quite. For one thing, the easiest way to get it is probably in the response to the negation of summons, which, while not entirely useless, is far less common by the time this card was released than it has been throughout the history of the game. Once upon a time in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, players would run the Solemn Brigade, which referred to the maximum legal number of Solemn traps at the time, 2 warnings and a judgment, and just about every meta deck did this. During this time, it wasn't uncommon to have your summons negated, but it's not 2012 anymore. And even with Warning, Judgment, and Strike all at 3 in the modern game, they've become far less played. They've been deemed as either too slow or as not beneficial enough to most decks and goals to merit seeing play. Why negate a summon when you can just turbo into your boss monsters and then win the duels that way? So while you may still encounter a Solemn card from the opponent in the odd Altergeist deck, or Guru, or maybe Paleo Frog, so any control deck really, most of your summons are not going to be negated. But that doesn't matter, you might say, because Ash Blossom is a card that you face daily, and it negates cards, and you just want to punish every bastard you've seen drop that card on you, which, if you are right about, would make this card a lot better than it is. You may hate Ash Blossom, fair enough, but this card doesn't work against Ash Blossom. And if you think it does, congratulations to you on becoming more and more of a true duelist, as you have not fully read both of those cards. Because the key word that people, and admittedly including myself when I first saw this, overlook on Witch's Strike is activation. Witch's Strike can only be used if the activation of a card or effect is negated, not just if an effect is negated, which, if you aren't aware, is a pretty big distinction in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you negate a card's activation, that means that that card has not been activated that turn. So for cards like Lightning Storm or Shaddoll Fusion or, I don't know, Artifact Sanctum, if you negate that activation with a Solemn card, or any card that specifically states negates the activation, you can legally activate a second copy of it that turn because that's the first one being activated. The first activation was negated. It didn't happen. The same can't be said when the effect but not the activation is negated, which includes the likes of Ash Blossom, which reads negate that effect, not the activation. Which begs the question, how many cards do negate the activation of a card or effect and not just negate the effect? Dueling Book lists 16 pages of them, which is a little over 300, but again, that includes cards like, say, Chivalry. And while I'm sure War Rock players everywhere are terrified of this trap in particular, most of us aren't. Most notably, things like Ash Blossom and Effect Veiler only negate the effects, not the activation. There's also Infinite Impermanence and even Crossout Designator, which all don't stop the activation, and those are by far the most common form of negates that you're going to run into. There are some relatively common threats, though, that negate activation. Things like Appaloosa, Baron, Ghost Bell does, and even the same goes for Psyframe Gamma. Hell, even Borreload Savage Dragon, which is the cover card of the set that Witch's Strike debuted in. And those are all fairly common enough, and they trigger this card, so why isn't this card seeing play? Honestly, I think the main and biggest reason this isn't seeing play is because people give it a quick read, try it out at maybe locals or more likely an automated simulator like Edo Pro or Master Duel, have it on the field, realize they can't just chain it to Ash Blossom, get mad, assume that the card isn't working, and then drop it. Ignoring that situation, the other big reason it's not seeing play is honestly because it's a trap. At the earliest this card can go off, it's turn 2, which means you went first, and the opponent uses something like Baron to negate a card, and then you can use this and go off. Which, while possible, it isn't guaranteed, and that means you're not going to see payoff for it until turn 3. And that's the real kicker about it all, is that the opponent has to use a negate. You have to let them get a specific type of negate, one that will negate the activation of a card, which means that you're going to let their plays go through, so there's a chance that this card itself will ultimately be negated, since it's just a normal trap that can completely and totally be responded to. Like I mentioned earlier, the Solemn Traps are all at 3, and they barely see play. That's 9 potential Speed Spell 3 cards, the highest in the game that can only be responded to with other Speed Spell 3 cards that just aren't seeing play, despite the fact that they can stop just about every meaningful thing the opponent can do. And they just aren't in the majority of decks. And then you have to compare it to Witch's Strike, a card that has to let the opponent stop a play from you and can be responded to by all conventional means in Yu-Gi-Oh!, including itself being negated. And that has to compete with all the other problems that trap cards in general have, being reactive in nature and really doing nothing to help set up a turn 1. Compare to other traps that you could play instead: Ice Dragon's Prison, Dimensional Barrier, and Infinite Impermanence, which all immediately impact the duel and when you want them to, plus the fact that they can be used to stop and disrupt plays to prevent the opponent from building negates at all, as opposed to this. There's also mentioning the fact that this card is like a sneak attack in that it really only works once. If it goes off in game 1, you can be sure the opponent will play around it to the best of their ability in games 2 and 3. Overall, it's a powerful trap, but it's one that's hindered by the need to negate activations, and ultimately is designed to try and punish the opponent for being in a winning condition, which means that by the time you're getting to activate it, the opponent's more or less in a winning position. And so that's our look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Single card history, Witch's Strike. Stay tuned for our next video, and feel free to suggest some cards to review or what type of video you'd like to see. Don't forget to like, and as always, subscribe to YGO Strats so you too can become a true duelist.